I'll give everyone one more minute. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Caroline. I'm so glad that you could be here with us today for a group therapy for nonprofit fundraisers. Our topic is focused on grant writing in a crowded landscape, and it's hosted by SparkPoint Fundraising. Um, I am the Senior Operations and Marketing Manager here at SparkPoint, and I'll be your moderator today, handling all things tech support, managing the Q&A, and keeping us on track as we dive into the conversation. We know that securing grants right now feels harder than ever, and with shifting funder priorities and increased competition, with limited capacity, we know that it could be challenging to focus your energy. And that's why we created this space, um, to be able to help you navigate the fundraising landscape with clarity, strategy, and a little bit of heart. Our incredible team today that's joined us is led by Whitney Brimfield, SparkPoint founder and strategic fundraising leader. And then also Hannah Payton, our client services manager and foundation relations specialist. And today, we'll walk you through some of the key areas that we found that could um, help organizations compete and thrive in a crowded grants landscape. So the three buckets that we'll be talking about today is adjusting your grant strategy to reflect today's realities, understand funder priorities and prospecting more effectively, and strengthening your internal systems and capacity to sustain long-term growth. Feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A box anytime, and we'll get to them as much as possible during the discussion. And I know that a lot of you have submitted your questions beforehand, so thank you again, and we'll be covering those today. Um, a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. We'd ask that everyone keep yourselves muted except for the presenters, unless we discuss one of your questions and you want to come off mute and chat through them a little bit. Um, and then if your connection is slow, try closing out other tabs or turning off your camera. If you get disconnected, just rejoin using the same Zoom link you received this morning. This session is being recorded, so you'll be able to receive the replay directly in your inbox later after the event. All right, so let's get started, and I'll turn it over to Whitney, our founder, to kick things off.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I know that we all need some community time in order to navigate all of the various and significant challenges that we're facing. Some of the things that we heard from you all, we kind of saw three big themes. Those are the three kind of areas that Caroline described that we'll cover today. But it sounds, based on what we've heard from everybody, like the biggest issues right now are first finding funders, new funders to apply to, uh, responding to the various policy shifts that have resulted in funders kind of moving their interests away from certain issues like environment, racial equity, the arts, and then also the impact of the significant cuts that have been made by various pieces of legislation, including the one big beautiful bill, which is really not so beautiful in my opinion. Um, so we want to get to as many of your questions as possible. And so I'm just going to start by jumping in and answering some of the biggest questions that we've heard. That's Caroline, that's what you want from us right at this moment, right?
Yeah, yeah. I
Okay.
can help. I can help ask those questions too. So, our revenue. So, someone submitted a question on their revenue from training is way down, so they need help to expand their foundation funds.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody right now is looking for new funders, more funding because they're having to replace money from other sources. So this is, I think, an issue that is affecting almost every nonprofit. I think I read somewhere that 47% of nonprofits that provide human services have seen drastic cuts in their revenue in the past 6 months. So the first thing I can say is everybody is dealing with this. That doesn't make it any easier, but it does make it, I feel like we're all in this together, even though we are in some cases competing. I think that the best source of new funders is talking to your current funders. So, who are your current funders? Who do they know? Who are funding organizations like yours? And what introductions can they make? Should be one of the conversations you're having with every single funder right now. I think the other really important thing is that in times like these, stewardship and making sure that your funders are connected to your mission is incredibly important. So, spending time on a stewardship strategy that involves periodic outreach to your existing funders, starting with potentially one on one conversations with each, where you talk about your funding gaps and not with the expectation that your current funders are going to fill those gaps, but with the expectation that they will help you identify other funders that could help fill those gaps. So I think that's a great first actionable step for everyone is set up calls with all of your current funders, and talk to them about what you need and the various ways that they can help you fulfill those needs without asking for more money. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to ask for more money. I think it should be clear that to funders that what you need includes additional money from them, but I wouldn't go into those conversations expecting or relying on larger gifts to fill the gap. It's not unreasonable, though, to ask for them. I think the better and more engaged you are, the better relationship you have, the more engaged your funders are with your work, the more likely you are to be successful in garnering additional money and funder connections from those conversations. So really being clear about what your impact is, even despite all of the challenges that you're facing, is another, I think, really important approach to communicating with funders. Um, but I'd like to stop talking for a second, see if Hannah has anything to add at this point, or if there are other things we can address around this issue from the audience.
Yeah, I'd say I agree with all of that. I think too, I think it can feel a little scary to reach out to funders and say like our revenue is down, our numbers are down, our participants, we're having fewer participants. I think that you need to be honest about those things, but it may help to prepare for these meetings by having kind of a few solutions to offer, like come in and say, like, this is where we're at. If this continues, we're going to have to, close programs, lay off staff, like whatever that's going to actually look like. The things we're working on, like we're looking to develop new relationships. Maybe we've like applied to these funders already, just so that you can show that you're asking for help, but you also have a plan.
Great. Awesome. Um, Another organization shared that their biggest challenge in fundraising is for environmental issues when it has become so polarized.
Yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think that's, I know that the person writing in was looking at this from a specific lens of like environmental work, but I think that this is true for a lot of organizations, even I mean, even things like food pantries that have not really had that in the past. I think in the current atmosphere, so many aspects of our work can feel or have become like politicized or polarizing. And I think that one of the most important things is just knowing your audience. Like, look at how the funder talks about it. Like, have they, if they have a focus on environmental justice, or conservation, they look at how they've been reacting. Like, have they pulled back on, have they kind of tried to bring their language in, like make it less politicized, maybe like less, I don't want to say inflammatory because I don't think it is inflammatory, but like, does it seem like they're backing down or does it seem like they're standing firm? If they're standing firm, keep talking about it the way that you always have, and maybe even include like, a challenge we're facing is that even though this work touches everybody, even though this work is important for everybody's well-being on this entire planet, like it has become politicized, it has become difficult to talk about. Um, if they're like a more general funder, or if you get the sense or you've received information that they are kind of, stepping away from that, not interested in, um, I don't know, I guess kind of stepping up and fighting, then I think you can change your approach and you can like just really focus, like don't use the standard language you always use. Look at ways to, um, really generalize it, talk about how it is impacting actual human beings that in a way that the funder may be able to empathize with. And Whitney, I'll kick it over to you if you have any other thoughts.
I think, when one type of funder steps away is a time when you need to look for other types of funders too. So I think all of you who are talking, I mean, I know everybody's always wanting to diversify their funding streams. So this is not a new concept. But it's very, when things are going well, it's easy to put that kind of lower on the priority list. It needs to go back up to the top now. There's really no more low-hanging fruit to be had for anyone. So every new prospect is going to require a lot more work than it has in the past. And I think part of that is setting expectations internally, right, as much as you can. I realize it's not always easy to manage the expectations of those for whom you are fundraising. But as much as you can, I think it's important that leadership understands what is and isn't possible during this time, right? This is not going to be a time period when, unfortunately, when arts and environment organizations in particular are, and a number of other groups, reproductive justice, et cetera, are going to be growing significantly, even despite the fact that there's still significant need. I think the other thing to pay attention to is that funders, just like everyone else, tend to have a little bit of shiny object syndrome. So the things that are getting the most attention publicly in the press. So like this week, it's all about SNAP. You're hearing all about the cuts to SNAP that are happening and how that is combining with the current shutdown of the government to cause really significantly high needs in food pantries. So, this month, that's what funders are thinking about. Not every organization obviously is giving away food or affecting the, lack of food in the country in the same way, but there are ways to draw lines back to some of these issues, right? I think, environment and food, there's an obvious connection. Um, and it's not that your environmental justice organization is going to solve the SNAP crisis, but what work are you doing that contributes to overall your community being healthier? How can you be supporting other organizations in their work? I think now is also a time when it's helpful to come together with your partners, your nonprofit partners, in ways that you wouldn't typically, and to talk more often and in more detail about how you're dealing with what is happening in your specific space. I think, funders always love to see partnerships and collaboration happening. I realize those things take time and effort and money. But as much as you can, I think having conversations with your colleague organizations and finding ways to coordinate and even if possible, share resources. I know there are some organizations in DC that have done that in the past. It's something that a lot of organizations did with varying levels of success during the pandemic. And I think it's always helpful to try to do that work together when possible. Um, Even if it's just to share strategies and you can't, there's not much else you can do. But I think finding ways to contribute to how your community is currently addressing the biggest problem is one way. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that you change your mission or do scope creep, but find out where those intersections are and use those to your advantage. And that can help you then to break into other types of funder buckets, so that you become less reliant on just the environment funders or just the arts funders. And also, it can open you up to bigger, funding relationships when you're showing your current funders how you're super strategic in building alliances in a time when people are struggling. Um, So I think, setting aside some time to think with your team about how to do that in a way that's manageable would be a good use of time. Um, and I think also continuing to communicate with your funders, the ones that are still committed to and stepping up on your issue, you can help influence how they decide to do things and to be a thought partner with your funders and how to manage because they're also wondering what to do, right? They also have limited resources and you know, are also being asked to stretch them. So we all have to kind of treat this as a time when we're kind of in this together, figuring out what the solutions are. And I think, funders are looking for solutions beyond just what you offer and in terms of impact and ideas. And so having those conversations is of great value to both you and your funders. So if you have ideas about how funders can be more supportive, how funders can help you coordinate, um, and share resources, those are things that funders would like to know about. So it's not just about you finding more money, but all of us sharing resources and various resources in different ways in order to get us through this moment. That was a long
Very,
answer.
no, but very well said. Thank you, Whitney. Since we're shifting a little bit the conversation to funders and what they are looking for and how can nonprofits continue that good relationship building, somebody submitted a question on they are finding that funders want larger community impact. And in many cases, this is inhibiting when we already serve as many as possible. How do we get funders to buy into the work we do for our target community?
Um, Hannah, would you like to start with this one?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Winnie kind of answered some of this in what you were just saying. I think that probably the place to start here would be looking at partnerships, because you don't want to, you don't want to overpromise or, um, you know, people are at capacity. Like people are working, they're doing as much as they can. Like nonprofits are doing everything right now with less than ever, I think. And so I think that the best way to like speak to that and to expand is to look into partnerships. And I know I heard recently about one foundation that I was helping somebody apply to that they'd heard that their new mantra was like too big to fail. Everybody has to apply as a partner or like a coalition. And I think that that is um definitely like a strategy that I'm seeing on the foundation side. So I think investing in those partnerships and finding ways to make it work and make it make sense for your organization would probably be where I start there. Whitney, do you have anything to add?
No, that was perfect.
Awesome. And what about in the case? So something that we also received with the questions that we reviewed was that there's a lot of pipeline anxiety, and that people are really concerned with finding new things to apply to. And specifically, is there any point to approaching places that don't accept unsolicited requests? Example, like introducing ourselves through a letter. How would you all go about that?
Yes, there is a point to reaching out to funders that don't accept unsolicited requests. What they're saying when they say that is they don't want you to send them a proposal unsolicited. It doesn't mean that they don't want you to try to build a relationship with them. So, yes, it's totally appropriate to reach out with a brief introduction about your organization. That is a strategic piece of writing that will require some it's not something you can just dash off in a 2-minute email. You have to be thoughtful about what you put in that introduction because you're trying to get a foundation person who hears from hundreds of people every day to get as interested as they can possibly be in what you're interested in talking to them about so that they say yes to a meeting. So, yes, it's possible to do a cold introduction to a foundation and get a meeting out of it. It's not the easiest way, it's not the fastest way, but it is possible. Um, I think that there are, one way to find out which funders are more amenable to those things and which are not is to talk to your colleagues. I think, one of the most helpful things that I've found when I've been a frontline fundraiser is having communities of practice that I went to talk about how I was doing things. So, I know in the DC area, there are, through the DC chapter of AFP, there are various affinity groups. And so those groups meet and they talk about how their fundraising is working in their individual area of work. If you have access to something like that in your community, I would highly recommend you start being a participant in those conversations. It's going to help you figure out who to talk to and how to talk to them. The other thing to do is get introductions. So, existing funders, existing individual donors, and board members, staff, friends of yours, all of these people potentially have relationships that they can leverage on your behalf. You have to ask them. That's the only way you're going to find out if they can do it. Um, and I think anytime a funder is asked for help to connect to another funder, that's a good thing in their eyes, right? You're doing the work to identify ways to not be solely reliant on them. So, no funder who's currently giving you money unless they have explicitly said so to you, is going to be unwelcoming of that kind of request. Um, some funders just don't know anybody. That's, the smaller funders in particular who don't have as much time, who may not have full-time staff, those aren't going to be your best bets for getting introductions. I think the best bets for introductions are program officers who work at larger foundations, who have more time to network and who are kind of more actively engaged in the community around them. And donor advisors, they also tend to have a lot of information about how money is given away, especially from groups that are harder to reach, like small family foundations and donor advised funds. I think also engaging with your local community foundation is another important way to help you build relationships because community foundations often hold relationships with a lot of those smaller funders who have money to give. Um, so those are some of the suggestions I have, but I'm sure Hannah also has some more.
I mean, honestly, I think that was a really comprehensive answer. And I know I'm looking at some of the other questions that came in, and I know we want to attack this from some different angles. So I
Okay.
think we can actually move on to the next question.
Wonderful. So a little bit on trying to get a major foundation individual prospect's attention when they have zero contact info, won't take unsolicited proposals, and don't respond but have clear alignment with your mission.
Um, Make sure you're using all the potential sources to get contact information. Um, One that I found incredibly helpful is Inside Philanthropy, and it's not very expensive to join. I think it's like $75 a year. So it should be a reasonably manageable expense. They have an excellent database of smaller funders and also larger funders, contact information. Use it. Also, AI doesn't like we don't even know that we haven't even yet harnessed the power of how AI can advance prospect research. I mean, we've probably barely scratched the surface as an entire community. So use AI. I can't tell you how because there's vastly different numbers of ways to do it. But I think, one of the AI sources of information that I'm aware of as being more research focused is Perplexity. I find that it is really helpful for doing kind of in-depth research on informational topics. I have yet to try to use it to research into, donor information, but I think it's worth a try. Um, and of course, if you have access to donor search, wealth engine, those sorts of sources, those are also helpful, especially for identifying small family foundations. There's also a news service that is focused on donor advised funds that's called Definitive, DAFINITIVE, I believe, which is a database of donor advised fund information that you can also pay for access to. Um, again, all of these sources, you have to weigh the value and the return on investment with the cost. I think it's very high for inside philanthropy. Definitive is a little bit more expensive. I believe it's like 800 or $1,000 a year. Still, like compared to Wealth Engine and other types of search engines for that stuff, cheap. But and also, the information that the definitive database has is always growing, but it's limited. So like it's not an ultimate solution to all of the lack of transparency that it comes with DAFs. But I think the combination of a program like Definitive and a really strong relationship with the relevant community foundations can give you a really strong combination of sources.
Yeah, definitely. Those are all really good tools. A couple other tools that I use sometimes. Um there's a website called Apollo that has a free tier of service, and then there's more that you can pay for. And I've had pretty good luck finding contact information for at least larger, like mid-sized foundations, foundation officers. Um, if you have an executive or somebody on your team that has like I can't remember what it's called, like the higher level of LinkedIn, sometimes you
Oh,
can
LinkedIn Navigator
yeah, LinkedIn
or
Navigator,
Sales
sometimes you
Navigator.
can
Yeah.
sometimes you can send messages and contact people that way. And then my low tech answer is look at who else they're funding and see if there's a partner organization, somebody that you work with, or maybe somebody that you just know the fundraising team there, and see one, just talk to them and see if you can get the temp on that funder. Like, are they really just like closed down? They want to fund the same 8 people forever, even though your alignment is perfect? Or, would they maybe make an introduction for you or share some contact information?
Awesome. And I believe we touched a little bit on this question, but um, how can we start conversations with potential new funders who are seeing increased requests across the board?
I
Sorry,
mean,
Carolyn.
I think that you can acknowledge the reality of the situation. You can say like, we know that you're getting more requests. We know that like things are really difficult for the nonprofits you're working with. And then give them a reason to be interested in what you're doing. Like, what's the but there? Like, but we have this new program. We think this is really well aligned. And when you're kind of trying to catch the interest of somebody new, I would really recommend having some very compelling impact data that you can lead with. Because when people have less funding to distribute, or when they're experiencing like feelings of scarcity and stress, they want to know that they're putting their money where it's going to be the most effective. So the faster in these initial conversations you can kind of demonstrate that, I think that will serve you well.
Awesome. Um, okay, and shifting a little bit the conversation to major and individual gifts. So some people have concerns on diversifying their funding stream, growing philanthropic revenues from both individual and organizations. What are some tips or strategies you have?
Um, I think relationships are even more important with individuals than with foundations, especially if you're talking about major donors, whatever that means for your organization. So, like with your foundation funders, I would also be having regular conversations with your larger individual donors, let's say like your top 10 to 15 individual donors should be treated the same as your foundation funders in terms of the updates they get, the communication they get. I think the more of a connection you build with each of those individuals, the more likely you're going to be able to ask them for help and support, similar to the way you do with foundations in this time, right? So you can also ask them for help connecting to people. You can also ask them for more money. You have to have a really, I mean, I think that what Hannah said about the impact statement is also relevant here. Individuals are getting increased requests for money just like foundations are, and it's an even harder calculus for them because they don't have kind of the parameters around their giving that a foundation might for themselves, right? Like they could do anything they want. They may have set some specific guidelines and they follow those. But I think it's even harder when it's an individual and it's your money and you're thinking about your legacy and your what you care about and the concern that everybody's carrying for what's going on right now. It's all of those things are swirling around in somebody's head when they're reading an appeal, trying to make a decision. So the quicker you can cut to the depth of your impact and connect that back to what the individual donor is really interested in, the more successful you're going to be. Um, and the only way you can really know what your donors are interested in is if you talk to them. And it makes them feel good to have one-on-one conversations with you too. So I'll stop talking and see if anyone else has anything they want to add to that. But I think it is really all about really strong communication and relationship management.
Yeah, I think the only other things I would add to that, and these are kind of communication strategies that you can use in service of kind of like that larger vision that Whitney was articulating, is I think people are really starving for good news right now. So while you should be like vulnerable about challenges and like making these asks for support, whether it's financial or otherwise, I think people also love to hear what's going well. So if you have, a success to share, if you have like a great story, like a personal story that came through that you are able to share, like I think those sorts of things are always great. But I think like right now they really have an emotional impact that can support this relationship building. Um, and I think kind of on a related note, people are really hungry for community as well. So if you have opportunities not just to, send newsletters or updates or make phone calls, but really invite people in if there are like events or volunteer opportunities. This is not groundbreaking. You're probably doing some of this anyway, but I think that right now that also has a heightened impact.
One of the questions I saw somebody was saying, how do we share all of the challenges we're having with our donors without sounding like we're complaining? Um, I first of all, I think expressing what you need to achieve your mission, even if you don't have it currently, is not complaining. But I think that's what it's really about, right? It's about focusing on your goals and comparing that to what's possible with the current funding you have and giving people, especially individual donors, really concrete ways for them to help close the gap is going to be the thing that makes the difference. So, what are the most tangible things you're doing right now that you need additional funding to do? And that only your organization can really do. Those are the things that your major donors are going to want to know most about in this moment. So figure out what those things are and lead with them in your conversations.
One other thought on that, I think you can also lead from kind of a lens of like education because there's so much going on that even for funders who are like fairly focused on a couple of specific areas, I think that there's probably like details to your work and details to the struggles that you're having right now that they are maybe not aware of or only peripherally aware of. So I think you can also, like, you're not complaining, you're explaining what's going on. And I think that I've seen a lot of funders really have an appetite for that right now because there is so much information to like sift through and synthesize right now. Like having one of your trusted partners explain to you what is going on the ground from their perspective is not only like not a burden, you're not complaining, but it's also like valuable to hear that.
I think that's especially true for policy organizations. You all are doing the work every day to know what's happening, and you have a much more vast knowledge of it than your funders ever will. So you are an incredible resource to them. And the more you can play that role for your funders, the better off you're going to be in the long run with them. Because if they begin to look to you as a resource, then you have value beyond your impact as an organization. You have value that you're, providing directly to the foundation for their functioning. And I think the same is true of individuals, although to a lesser extent because they're not as concerned with staying on top of everything, but they like to know what's going on and they like to get the insider info. So I think Funder briefings, donor briefings are a great way to do that, to start those conversations. And then, you likely will have certain funders or donors who come to you after something like that and say, oh, could you do this for my team? Could you like give me a longer version of this one-on-one? Like those are the kinds of things you want to have happen after that, because those are the conversations that then lead to more funding because they can see, oh, this organization not only has a mission that we're invested in, they have great impact and they know what's going on. So our money is going to go further with them than it would go with an organization that's less on the ball or less focused on the policy work. It's not always about how you're performing.
Absolutely. And what about for an organization who doesn't have a track record of major gifts or individual giving? How would they approach that, and what are some strategies to get that money in the door?
I mean, if you think about your organization as a set of concentric circles of community, right? Like the first in like the inner circle is the staff, and then the next circle out is the staff and the board. And then the next circle out is the staff and the board and the funders. And then the next circle out is the staff and the board and the funders and the individual donors. That's how you can kind of think about prioritizing a major gifts program when you don't already have one. Your board is obviously, those are the folks who have dedicated their time, talent, and treasure to your organization by nature of serving on the board. And of course, we all know that the goal is that every board member is giving to an organization in a way that's significant to them. So one great way to seed an individual giving in a major gifts program is to start with your board of directors. Excuse me. Is every single one of your board members giving at a level that is meaningful to them? Um, does the board have a development committee that's focused on board giving? Are they asking board members, past board members, volunteers for money on an annual basis? Those are the places to start. And then as you begin to improve your funder or your donor relationships with each concentric circle, you move outward again. Um, and that's kind of how I've always been taught to think about how to start a major gifts program. But I'm sure that many of you also have thoughts about that. Maybe not. I mean, I think the other thing is like, yes, you can start a major gifts program on your strategy, but a major gifts program requires a lot of attention. So I think you also have to be realistic about what's possible with the staff you have, right? Like ideally, a major gifts program has at least one dedicated person whose only job is major gifts. Most nonprofits don't have the luxury of multiple people in their development department. So then, it's not that you just do more work and multiply or by, huge numbers the amount of time you spend working. It's more about prioritizing and making sure that you're making realistic commitments to your strategy, right? Like you can't do everything, and you should prioritize doing the things that are going to have the greatest return on investment. And certainly building a major gifts program could be one of those things, but it has to be balanced with, the time it's going to take to build. If you start building a major gifts program today, you're not going to have a fully functioning major gifts program probably for 12 months, even if you had a full-time person dedicated to it. So you just have to be realistic about what you can achieve. And, as hard as it is, I know, to push back on leadership about what's realistic, it is important.
Is anyone here having some challenges with major gifts or individual giving, and you want to have some clarifying questions on this topic? Okay. Um, so there were a couple folks also curious about um, strengthening their internal systems and capacity. Um, and their issues dealing with tracking, reporting, and long-term strategy. So someone asked about easy tracking donor data needed for reporting and analysis insights. Do we have any recommendations on that front?
I mean, I think the most important thing is that good donor data comes from a well set up donor database. And that in itself is a big project. This is again a time when it's important to be realistic, right? That the small donor database that Monique's asking about the small. Oh, I think it was Inside Philanthropy, Monique. Sorry, I saw that question come up. Um, and then Definitive was the other one for donor advised funds. Um, but I lost my train of thought. We were talking about Caroline. Could you remind me?
Yes, we were talking about easily tracking donor data needed for reporting and analysis insights.
So, I mean, I think it depends on what kind of data tracking you have, what kind of data tracking capacity you have, right? I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to go and switch over to the very fancy donor database. That's a lot of work and not necessary for a lot of organizations. But even if you just keep your information in a spreadsheet, um, it's really about using the tools that you have to the greatest effect, right? So you might have a variety of different metrics that you want to measure against your fundraising. So new giving, repeat giving, increased giving from repeat donors. That applies to both institutional and individual donors. You want to be tracking that information. Um, and then if you're doing a lot of direct mail, direct marketing, emails, et cetera, then you might be tracking some information about what your average gift is from a donor, um, what the lifetime giving is of an individual, um, what the patterns of when a specific person gives during the year. Those are all the kinds of data that you would like to track. Um, but I think if you have to choose between setting up a system that provides you with really good data about your donors and spending time on stewardship and relationship building, I would focus on the relationship building and stewardship over the metrics in this moment. Because while the metrics are going to give you good long-term information about the behavior of your donors, the relationships and the conversations that you have in the process of building and maintaining those relationships are going to give you a lot more intelligence about what your donors are interested in and responding to. And I think in this moment, that is more important. Um, if you have the luxury of being able to do both at once because you have the money and the staff, then that's awesome. And you should definitely invest in creating a donor database, identifying and setting up, I should say, a donor database that supports your organization. I think a lot of nonprofits, even some of the larger ones, can get away with something less fancy. So Bloomerang, for example, is one that I know a lot of smaller nonprofits use, but larger nonprofits use it too. It's very user friendly, easy to set up, and also very relatively inexpensive compared to others. Doesn't require a lot of customization like Salesforce does, isn't as big or complicated as a Razor's Edge. So that's a great option. There are others like it. Um, this is another place where I think AI might be incredibly helpful as a way to help you vet which options are best for your organization. Um, but yeah, there's lots of ways to manage all of that.
Wonderful. We have a chat question here
Ooh.
or in the Q&A box. So this person said, I work for an organization with a large operational budget who has been turned away by small foundations for being too large. Do you have any advice on how to appeal to these smaller foundations?
I think start by looking at their average gift, right? So, like, it may be that for you, for your organization, a lot of these foundations should be treated like major donors, individual major donors, than like a regular foundation. And so, if you approach them from the perspective of an individual donor as opposed to a foundation funder, that might be more successful. Also, look at like their like what they're giving is it enough? Like, so, if you put them in a major donor category, it might be enough. So, like a foundation that's giving $5,000 annually to, 12 organizations, they may see your budget and think, oh, my $5,000 isn't going to go very far. But if they're getting an individual donor ask, it's going to look different. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is be really conscientious about combing through their materials. I know the smaller foundations tend to have less and less of that information. But just look and see what they say. They may have some really clear statement somewhere, if whether it's in their 990 on their website, where it says like we just don't give to organizations above a certain size, and then you don't have to spend time on them. So I think, and I'm not. That's not to say that you haven't already done that, but I think those are my two kind of suggestions. Are either maybe you need to treat them differently, or they're not really a prospect.
Yeah, I think definitely like be realistic about whether or not they're actually a fit because sometimes it's just they're just not going to be interested, in organizations over a certain size. But, if you're looking at their past giving and you feel like there is like good alignment and that you have a chance, you may also want to look for ways just to make your work more bite-sized. So don't give them like a general operating proposal, like find a place in your organization where $5,000 could really make a difference, and focus on that.
Awesome. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Cool.
Um, so if anyone wants to come off mic or put your questions in the chat or the Q&A box, let us know. Now's your time. Um, Whitney or Hannah, do you have any last comments on some of the questions we've received that you think would be helpful to circle back to?
I mean, I think I can't emphasize the importance of relationships enough. Oh, I'll talk about Jennifer's question about capital funds. Um, the relationships are is going to make the difference. So spending time on relationship building, management, stewardship is going to be the most critical thing you can do. In terms of capital fundraising, typically when you're running a capital campaign, I don't know what stage you're in the process, but capital funding from foundations is going to be limited either to those foundations that actually have programs to give capital or those foundations with whom you have a strong enough relationship that a second capital ask in any given year would be welcome. And that again is about having conversations before you make the ask, right? So I would suggest for your foundation funders, um, when you have your next stewardship conversation with them, ideally the one where you're, talking about your next ask, you tell them, hey, listen, in addition to our annual fund request, we'd like to make a capital request. Is that possible? You may also have to be prepared in that conversation to talk a little bit about what the capital request is for. So have your case for support handy. Um, but that is typically the way it's done with existing funders is you ask them if they'd be open to such a request, and then you submit that alongside of your typical annual fund request. With individuals, it's similar, but I think you also have to be thoughtful about who gets those capital requests, right? Like you want those to come initially to donors with whom you have a strong relationship who've invested over time in your organization and would see the connection between their giving interests and a capital campaign investment. So part of that is what are you, especially for individual donors, what are you offering them in terms of recognition is going to be part of their decision-making process. So best to have your case for support with all of your naming options and all of those things clear before you have those conversations. Or, depending on where you are in your process, if you're in the feasibility phase, you can be having conversations with some of your larger donors about what those benefits and naming rights should look like, right? So like those are the kinds of that's the value of a feasibility study when you're doing a capital campaign, is that you really get a sense for who is a likely lead donor in your campaign and what do they want to see in that ask. So again, it's all about who you're talking to and what they already know about the organization and their commitment to it.
Um, we have one more question in the chat box. Do you have any good strategies on asking for feedback on a declined application?
First of all, follow the foundation's guidance. Some tell you that they aren't going to have those conversations, as annoying as that is. At least they tell you, so you don't have to get into the discomfort of asking and then getting told no. For the ones who don't, I think the best approach is, I mean, it's definitely reasonable to ask for the feedback, so don't ever hesitate as long as they have not said not to. Um, but just tell them, we want to be more successful next time. This is, a very, as you know, a very competitive funding landscape. So we really want to learn from this situation. What can you tell us? How can we improve? And again, it's going to be easier to make those requests if you've had conversations in the past. Now, with a new funder, it's not always that easy to have those conversations before you submit. But when you are able to do it, that's a great way to follow up after. And it's not unreasonable to ask for that. So don't hesitate to do it. I think it's okay to do it over email. Although I find that foundation funders, most of them have a tendency to ignore emails from people that aren't like already in it grantee. So you might have to make some phone calls. I think it's okay to be assertive about this with funders and know your limits, right? Like you all are fundraisers, so you have enough emotional intelligence to know when somebody's annoyed and then you stop. But I think that you can push those limits a little bit, especially with funders that you already know. But Hannah might have some more strategies for the actual conversation of like what kind of questions to ask once you're in it.
Yeah. I mean, I think like if if you had any questions or misgivings going into it, like if you were thinking, okay, this is kind of a stretch, or like, I'm not sure this is speaking exactly to their funding area, like those are definitely things to pay attention to, and those can inform the conversation. And I think that I agree, with Whitney, like, I think that you can be candid without pushing too far, but I think potentially, like, two great outcomes that you could get from this process would be like usable feedback that you can use to improve your next application, or hearing from them that they're just really not interested in your work right now. Because we always say at SparkPoint that like the second best thing a funder can say after yes is no, like a clear no, because then you won't continue to invest time in that in the future in this landscape where we're all trying to do the most with the limited time that we have. So I think that if you can kind of frame it that way to yourself too, that can help take some of the pressure off of the conversation.
Awesome. Well, um, that's the end of our session. I wanted to thank you all so much for joining our group therapy for nonprofit fundraisers and grant writing in a crowded landscape. Again, we hope today's conversation has helped you see new ways to adapt your grant writing strategy and your grant strategy, better understand funder expectations, and strengthen your internal systems to set your organization up for long-term success. Um, We'll be sending out the session recording soon, so keep an eye on your inbox. And if you'd like to dive deeper or get personalized support, feel free to scan our QR code or email our team at info@sparkpoint.com, or you can contact us directly on our website. Thank you again so much. I hope you all enjoy
Helpful,
and
Monique.
yeah. And let us know if you want to hear any other discussion topics or things that will help you set you up for success.